attacks, but also any critical analysis of the Israeli state in relation to Palestinians, as they have in the past. In dominant European countries like Germany and France, institutional politics have taken aim at what has come of late to be identified under the banner of post-colonial studies, which is deemed to be inherited from, quote, American academic discourse, because foreign to European values of universalism and post-war, so to speak, non-racialism. One might ask, provincializing Europe, anyone? Have any of the current critics actually read any of the critical literature? This mobilization, there's a curious inversion at play. In the 1980s and 1990s, the dominance of Parisian intellectual influence, if not intellectual imperialism, was bemoaned by the conservative attack on critical ideas and progressive political shaping in the US. This seems now reversed, perhaps turnaround is fair play. Claims, at least implicit, to French exceptionality reinforces nationalist refusals of the mobile, migratory, and relational interplay of ideas, which, like environmental forces and perhaps now the pandemic, pay little attention to borders and boundaries. And curiously, the current insistence among French politicians and insular intellectuals today that post-coloniality has no reference point in the French case implicitly acknowledges the ongoing commitment of the French state to its extended coloniality. Thinking the constitutively relational conditions opens up ways of seeing, critiquing, and facing down the debilitating initiatives being mobilized, and forges anew possibilities of solidarity within and across the social conditions in question. To riff on Fanon, when they speak of France, everyone else should pay attention as they are speaking about you too. So it's on something like this canvas that our discussion will proceed today. It's a pleasure to introduce Françoise Vergès. She's a long-time interlocutor and co-programmer with UCHRI, and it's a delight to have renewed our engagement for this forum. Françoise has an extended history of intellectual production, political art, and cultural curation. She currently serves as the chair of the French National Committee for the Memory and History of Slavery. Of her too many books to cite here, the latest include Un féminisme décolonial, which was La Fabrique Édition in 2019, and in English, more recently, The Wombs of Women, Race, Capital, and Feminism from Duke in 2020, translated from a French version published a couple of years before that. So over to you, Françoise. Thanks very much.
Well, good evening, and thank you, David, for a very generous introduction. Thank you, of course, to David Theo Goldberg, to Oshri, and the team for hosting us. So tonight, our guests, in the order in which they would be speaking, will be Didier Fassin, Miriam Allais-Davis, Nadia Marzouki, and Nadia Yalaki-Siddiqui. So I will introduce them before. I will just say just a few words also as an introduction. It was David who had the idea of organizing some formal exchange on what it's happening in France, but also in the USA, in the UK, in Germany, and many other countries. Attack on the university, on research, on social science and the humanities, on medical research, And what did it say, all this attack? What did they say about the current moment? I, of course, agreed. In France, the attacks are not new. And I will say a few words on that history. But it was a declaration of Frédérique Vidal on February 14. She's the Minister of Higher Education and Research, who say, and I quote, that Islam leftism is a gangrene attacking the society as a whole and the university. And she asked that the National Center for Scientific Research conduct an assessment of all the research taking place in France. And she clarified later that it was to distinguish between academic research and activism. This declaration, when students in France are queuing in front of food banks, are poorer and poorer, cannot follow their classes, and some of them are even committing suicide when a university are impoverished. This, when the country is unable to overcome the pandemic, that poverty is increasing, and it cannot even vaccinate in some population. Vidal, I say, is not the first to raise the threat of Islamo-leftism and of the threat to French universalism and Republican value. And these threats are, communitarism, separatism, indigeneity, decolonial theory, post-colonial studies, inclusive writing, denunciation of blackface, cancel culture, wokeness, all this, of course, coming from bad America. University, as in France, and also they say that as in the United States, white men now cannot say a word, and must constantly be on guard about what they are saying. The attack comes from the far right, the right, but also from the center left and even the left, from feminists, from journalists, from intellectuals. Endless debate on TV, radios, articles, books, documentaries, present a French society under attack by Islam. Islamo-leftism, according, apparently was invented, but it's not very clear, by Pierre-André Taguieff, to describe, and I quote, a certain leftist third worldism, which found itself in pro-Palestinian mobilization, in particular in alliance with Islamists. Islam, Palestine, third worldism, these three things, these three elements will come back over and over in this construction of the threat that Islamo-leftism represent. Islam is also naturally hostile to women's rights. And I can quote Caroline Fourest saying, Islamo-leftists are those who, in the name of a communitarian and American vision of identity, fight universalist feminism and secularism. So this Islam that Islamo-leftists are defending is hostile to women's rights, is hostile to the Enlightenment, to Christianity, to civilization. But in fact, if we look back, we can see the roots of this movement in 1989 in the attack on the veil in school by white feminists who relentlessly attack, Islam and the veil as a sign, as a symbol of submission that led to the 2004 law against the wearing of any religious symbol in school, but it was really the veil that was, targeted. And I want to connect that, and this will be a question that I will want to ask to our guests, that I have also noticed that a lot of the person who are targeted in the attack, nowadays, are women, mostly women. So there's something there, the names that come back in the petition, in the letter, in the articles are name of women when we don't even have their, photo also. All these have roots in the colonial and racial history, in what Césaire and Fanon have described. But we can see also that under the presidency of Nicolas Sarkozy, François Hollande, and Emmanuel Macron, there was an acceleration. Let's, remember very quickly that Sarkozy wanted a Ministry of National Identity, that François Hollande wanted to modify the constitution to include the state of emergency regime and the extension of the deprivation of nationality to all dual national convicted of terrorism, even those who were born in France. He wished also to be able to expel more rapidly foreigners who represented an especially serious threat to public order or to country security. His Minister of Interior, Manuel Valls, declared after the 2004 attack that he had enough with excuses and cultural or sociological explanation, because to explain was to excuse. Since 2019, the attack have intensified. Petition, books, debate on TV, radio, article, showing, disturbing moment of Islam. This really set up a fear. Even though, as Juliette Gagnonet and Patrick Simon I found that only between 1960 and 2000, only 2% of articles in social science journal and magazine were on race and race question. So this is what we are saying today. Telling all the story will take much longer time, and we will have, in fact, to unpack all the different, people and how this, coalesce and contribute to produce this situation. But let me now turn to our guest, and let me introduce our first speaker, Didier Fassin. Didier Fassin is a trained physician and anthropologist who hold position in social science at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, and is director of studies in political and moral anthropology at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. His latest of many books include Life, a Critical User Manual, which is a translation of a French book published in 2018, and Mort d'un voyageur, une contre-enquête at Seuil 2020, the edited volume, A Time for Critic with Bernard Harcourt at Columbia University Press in 2019, and Deepening Divides, How Territorial Borders and Social Boundaries Delineate Our World, Pluto Press 2019. And so we ask each of our guests to give like a 5-6 minutes general statement, how they see the current movement and how they analyze this accusation of Islamo-leftism. Didier?
Yes, thank you very much, Françoise and David, for organizing this event. The recent public accusation by Frédérique Vidal, the French Minister of Higher Education and Research, that society as a whole, and universities more specifically, are corrupted by Islamo-leftism, which she sees as an, quote, alliance between Mao Zedong and the Ayatollah Khomeini, unquote, has raised indignation and generated protest from social scientists and scientific institutions. And even the French president has seemed to distance himself from these affirmations. However, one should not forget that 6 months earlier, Emmanuel Macron, 1 week after the death of George Floyd, and 2 days before a massive demonstration against police violence and racism in France, made the academic world guilty, his word, for having encouraged what he called the ethnicization of the social question, and thus contributed to what he called, again, the fracture of French society. And 4 months later, his Minister of Education had gone further even, deploring that Islamo-leftism wreaks havoc in universities and blaming France's oldest national student union for being the, quote, intellectual perpetrator of the assassination of a professor in high school. This accusatory language has received the support of the Rassemblement National, making Macron's Machiavellian calculation clear, and one should not forget that the French president wrote his undergraduate dissertation on the author of The Prince. The plan is that leading his party on the tails of the far right will help him win against Marine Le Pen in the second round of the 2022 presidential election, which polls predict to be very close. A confirmation of it is the fact that during his debate with Le Pen, the French Minister of the Interior ironically told her that he actually found her program toward Islam weak. This was for her an unexpected opportunity to present her party as less radical than it is commonly believed. However, a narrowly political reading of the accusations of Islamo-leftism misses the broader picture. The term is symptomatic of a culture war that crosses the traditional ideological division between left and right. The association made by Vidal between Islamo-leftism and academic studies on race, gender, and social class is a signal not only to conservatives, but also to an influential segment of French intellectuals. In recent years, a lively reactionary movement has taken off in the academy, targeting research on ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, and intersectionality, as well as colonialism, post-colonialism, decoloniality, and Islamophobia. This list even extends to the reversal, to the chagrin of the Académie Française, of the 17th century grammar rule according to which the masculine prevails over the feminine. By reaction, I mean an anxious rejection of the evolution of society, politics, and ideas, and a nostalgic endeavor to reestablish the past social, political, and intellectual order of things. The so-called Observatory of Decoloniality, an intellectual movement born at the beginning of this year, whose most famous figures are Pierre-André Taguieff and Nathalie Henich, denounces all allegedly non-universalistic approaches by parodying their language. The Republican Spring, a political movement created in 2016 to combat the far-right and political Islamism, with Laurent Bouvet and Marcel Gauchet, defends hardliner secularism, even having succeeded in canceling a conference on Islamophobia. Interestingly, the most recent and popular work in this line is by Stéphane Beau and Gérard Noiriel, two respected left-wing scholars of the working class for the former and immigration for the latter, who lament the replacement of class struggle by race struggle, denigrate post-colonial studies, sneer at the category of gender, dismiss intersectionality, and even consider that Black Lives Matter failed for having, quote, obscured power relations structuring our societies, unquote. From the perspective of these reactionary academics, race studies, research on racial discrimination, and the language of white privilege are seen as a threat to Republican universalism, and for some even as anti-white racism. The analysis of the colonial past and its present legacy, which with few exceptions has long been a blind spot in French historiography and sociology, is regarded as divisive and ideological. Meanwhile, organizations opposed to gay marriage, such as the influential Manif pour tous, have politicized gender, sexuality, and intersectionality to the point of obtaining the defunding of scientific programs on these questions. Curiously, these putative identity politics are all suspected to have been imported from US campuses without consideration for the fact that race relations have initially been studied in Britain, that the concept of decoloniality comes from Latin America, that the circulation of these theories are global, and that many of the ideas under critique were influenced by the so-called French theory. A remarkable feature of the reactionary movement is indeed its almost complete ignorance of the international literature. So just to conclude, behind the public accusation of Islamo-leftism in the university with its cynical strategy to seduce the right and far right, there is thus another, more complex and no less somber picture, that of a reactionary movement which strives to defame theories that have been developed for a better understanding of current social issues, and consequently, to deny or depreciate the disparities and injustices for which new instruments of analysis are provided. The improbable invention of the chimera of Islamo-leftism has thus permitted the convergence of Emmanuel Macron and his party with the Rassemblement National on the one hand, and with the reactionary segment of the intellectual world on the other. This cannot be without evoking the 1930s, when the resort to another chimera, Judeo-Bolshevism, served the same purpose. The parallel between the two periods should not be pushed too far, but the recent evolution of French politics is deeply disturbing and certainly deserves vigilance. Thank you.
Thank you, Didier. And we will come certainly back to your remark. So our next speaker is Miriam Allais-Davis, who teaches history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her work focuses on Algerian history, and she has a forthcoming book on Algerian the reinvention of the market economy in the post-war years and its impact on race and identity on both sides of the conflict shoreline. Her co-edited volume, North Africa and the Making of Europe, was published by Bloomsbury in 2018. She's also actively involved with Jadariya. Miriam?
Thank you, Françoise, and thank you, David, for inviting us all to be here. Also, thank you to the UCHRI team who puts this all together. I'd like to share a few thoughts about the historical roots of Islamo-gauchism as a concept. What makes this legible in France? I think for an Anglophone audience, the words involved are actually quite confusing. And then to reflect briefly on what kind of political work it's actually doing. The fact that it doesn't have a real existence does not mean that there's not real political work being done. First of all, the term gauchisme, which during a certain period of French history came to mean an infantile version of the left that did not fall in line with the Communist Party and that had certain kinds of third worldist commitments. So already there was an attempt to discipline what the left should look like by using this term. And in this compound word, Islam is a purposefully ambiguous signifier. Is it those who study Islam, those who are sympathetic to certain articulations of political Islam, or who, as the state would like us to think, excuse violence in the name of Islam? And so this amalgamation of terms is precisely at the heart of the debate. I also think it's important to point out that there was a Cold War imaginary where Islamists and totalitarian regimes shared a certain ideological form. So a commitment to unfreedom, for example, or a passionate set of attachments that were fundamentally irrational. So there was a twinning of pan-Islamism and communism that dates back to an earlier history, as Didier has just invoked. I know better, but I was recently listening to a debate on France 24 where somebody brought up Gaddafi as a precedent for Islamo-gauchism. And of course, this is a quite intentional invocation, but all of these attempts to stretch Marxism to think about other forms of whether that's Islam or indigeneity, which was part of a decolonization project, is now being policed. And I would argue that the question of Islam has long been used to discipline the forms of acceptable leftist politics in France. I was grateful that David brought up the question of Palestine. In Taguieff's early formulation of this, Palestine played a very important role. And perhaps we could come back to where we stand with that. It might seem as though the more pressing concerns of making excuses, quote unquote, or apologists for terrorism have come to occupy some of that place. In a longer durée history as well, these debates reflect an investment in the division of race from religion. And I think this is also something that to an American audience can be a little bit strange. The notion that religion is something that you choose and race is something assigned to you through biology, right, through skin color in the American context. And I would just point out in the Algerian context, Islam was a juridical marker that structured access to life and property and certain kind of legal discrimination. So even conversion did not get one to a better subject position, as it were. So this notion that some on the left have said that there is a right to be Islamophobic because Islam is about what you believe and not what you are, right? This has become a refrain that goes back to the French Revolution in some ways, saying, no, we fought for anti-clericalism, and the left cannot get involved in religion. That's one of the principles of leftism. And so there is also this broader history of religion's role in politics, both in the colonial and metropolitan framework. I appreciated also Didier's remarks, because this is, in many ways, a discussion on the center and in the left. The far right is, in some ways, outside of these debates about what constitute racism. We know that Marine Le Pen and her past and her father's past, that's not really the principal subject at hand. Many times people who use the accusation of Islamo-gauchism are donning the mantle of anti-racism themselves. So they say, I am committed to anti-racism, and they go on to say, what you're talking about cannot be racism and is therefore not subject to the debate. I will very quickly just mention what I think this work is doing right now. It's already been invoked that Macron has a broader project to fundamentally change the structures of the state with the another twinning of threats of austerity and authoritarianism. So the law on so-called Islamist separatism or the global security law are not only about discriminated against populations and peoples, but also about activism writ large. So there's a larger context to the reshaping of these structures. That's something we're seeing globally, from India to China to the US even. And as my last remark is, also picking up on this notion of importing American approaches when all along we thought we were doing French theory and perhaps nudging back against it a bit. The dream of empiricism, that this is not real science, this is not real research, by people who have not read any of it, who don't seem to understand the concepts at all, makes it no less dangerous. And I appreciated what Didier said as well about a nostalgia, because I think that empiricism offers a kind of promise of restitution, that we knew what real science was. And it was when a generation of scholars who were not people of color were setting the research agenda. It was okay if they were in classrooms, as long as they were setting and doing the work we had given them as appropriate topics. So I'll stop there, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Myriam. And I'm sure we will also go back to some of your remarks. The third speaker is Nadia Marzouki. She's a research fellow at the Centre National, at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CNRS, Paris. She received her PhD in political science for Sciences Po in 2008. Her work examined public controversy about Islam and religious freedom in Europe and the United States, and debate about religious freedom and democratization in North Africa. She's currently working on progressive economical alliance and interfaith movement in the United States and the Euro-Mediterranean area. She's the author of Islam, an American Religion, Columbia University Press 2017, and she co-edited Saving the People, How Populists Hijack Religion in 2017 at Oxford University Press. Nadia?
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this. Thanks David and Françoise, and thank you to the UCHRI. Thanks Didier and Myriam for your fascinating comments. I want to start with just expressing sort of general feeling of fatigue and stress and repetition that I, as an Islam scholar in the social sciences, and I think many of my colleagues feel right here in France and all over Europe and the US. And I was talking to Myriam a couple of days ago, and we were complaining about how we feel like, we're basically at the same place as we were about 6 years ago. So there's been a lot of focus right now on Islamo-gauchism, but the reality is that a lot of people who work in the social sciences around Muslim societies and practices have been dealing with the same degree of hate and attacks for the past 6 years. often in isolation. And especially this all started mostly, I think, in the context of the post-Charlie Hebdo and post-Bataclan attacks. And France has been dealing with this trauma since then at the expense to a certain extent of the academics working on these issues. So there is very much among scholars of our community this feeling that it's basically the same over and over again, and we are witnessing today's conversation with mixed feelings. We feel like we've seen that over and over again. We are happy with the extent of the solidarity that is somewhat new, but we also feel somehow saddened by the fact that as scholars of Islam, we have experiencing these attacks in isolation for many years, and we were sort of already mentioning all these issues. And I want to really salute here the work of all my friends and colleagues, Miriam, but also Beth Hurd, Sonia, Diane Hersbrun, Enver Iman. A number of them are here today, and they've been precious allies in all these years. What has changed is the level of unity and solidarity among academics today in France in face of these unacceptable attacks. And I really want to follow up on what Miriam and Didier have already said to reiterate how I think these comments made by Frédérique Vidal are absolutely unacceptable. They are endangering us, they are threatening us, they have unleashed a level of anger and a sense of self-righteousness among some right-wing trolls who are now publishing lists of names of academics and basically giving license to witch hunt them. And this is unacceptable. And I think this has to be really emphasized over and over again. The level of unity and solidarity and support from institutions, from the CNRS, from the universities, is something really that is very much appreciated and somewhat new because of the intensity of the attacks. The level of unity and solidarity from academics beyond the study of the Muslim world is related to the fact, as Didier mentioned, that the attackers have, in a way that is very confusing epistemologically, lumped together a number of disciplines and topics: decolonial studies, post-colonial studies, gender studies, race studies, ethnic studies, Islamic studies. So everything is lumped together in a very confusing way to describe the enemy that is infiltrating the academia and that is intoxicating the minds of young students. So I think because Islamo-leftism is sort of the pretext and the excuse to attack a number of studies that are deemed the result of the influence of US academia, this is what explains the unprecedented level of unity against the attacks of the government. I do want to pause, however, and maybe bring a question to this conversation, which is around maybe some challenges and some questions around this notion of allyship and solidarity within this big constellation of academics who are now united against Vidal, asking for her resignation and defending academic freedom. And I want to say that I feel sort of torn in front of this solidarity, because obviously this is what is needed right now, a broad coalition to produce outcomes. But as a scholar of Islam who has been the target, not me, but not just me and all my colleagues, I really don't want to speak in my name right here, but as scholars of Islam who have been targeted by this type of hate and violence and threats for so many years, we also feel like there may be some misunderstanding as to what exactly is defended in these big coalitions. So the broad argument is that we're all standing together for academic freedom. All right. And another argument is that, well, actually, it's not really anymore about scholars of Islam. It's about scholars of race, of gender, and also post-colonial world and a bunch of other things. And I want to pause maybe here on the juxtaposition of three things: Islam, race, and gender. And this sort of like flattening of these three contexts, these three concepts. And I, as a scholar of Islam, we have been confronted with major disagreements and debates around gender and freedom and the contours of this discussion. And we haven't always had the support of gender scholars. Far from it. There's been a lot of, on the contrary, they've like sort of secular feminists have often been the major instruments of the attacks against us, arguing that we are proposing all sorts of obscurantist, oppressive agendas and imposing them on students and academia. So I would want to see, not now, because that's not the time, but in the next step, a productive conversation among gender scholars, especially secular feminist scholars who claim to be our allies right now, but have been in so many conversations around these pressing issues. And what I've noticed is that there's always an unease when it comes to Islam. So we talk about Islamogauchism, but then no one wants to talk about Islam anymore. Everyone's like, yeah, it's not about Islam. It is about Islam. It is about race. It's about this and only this. And I'm not comfortable with this shift that seems very convenient to say, well, it's just about academic freedom. All right, but the academic freedom of some is threatened way more than the academic freedom of others. So this is something I'm really hoping in the next step we're gonna have as a productive conversations about all these people who claim to be allies. And one last thing, and I'll finish with that, Françoise, is that I wanna maybe suggest a comparison between the type of solidarity and allyship I have witnessed at the grassroots level after George Floyd's murder in France, the whole protest with Comité Adama and all sorts of things, and the type of allyship that seems to be more problematic at the level of academia. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. It's a very interesting point, and there will be a lot to say. And I do think that effectively the question of gender and feminism is very important in that conversation. But the question of alliance, I mean, we will go back to that. Let's not start the debate. So our next speaker and last speaker is Nadia Yalaki-Siddiqui, who teaches philosophy at the University of Paris 8 Vincennes. She has written widely on African philosophy and art. She also served as the adjunct director of the research center called Les Logiques Contemporaines de la Philosophie, Contemporary Logics of Philosophy. Her book on Bergson ou l'humanité créatrice was published in 2013. She's also the co-curator of the Yango Biennale in Kinshasa. Yala?
So thank you very much for this conversation. I'm very happy to be here, even if we are all here for very difficult reasons and very and it's quite hard, and I want to follow what Nadia said, because the fatigue is very high and our mental health are completely attacked, and those moments are very difficult to live in now in this situation of the academia in France. But I think there are many ways to understand what is happening now. Many ways to interpret and to explain the genealogies of those attacks. I'm not an historian of the ideas, but I just would like to focus on a word, separatism, kind of new word that is now in the French Republic. When did it appear? Or perhaps when was this word used by the head of state? and what was brought to the fore by this word. I don't want to draw too many cliches about my country. I will try, really. But if I want to caricature the type of political debates we have since more than 40 years, and I think I wasn't two words, universalism versus communautarisme, particularism, I would say, ethnicity in English, a kind of gigantomachie that describes the struggles defining the French Republic mythology. Okay, we all know that the idea of universalism in France, we also have a very strange expression, French universalism, a very quite singular oxymoron. But the idea of universalism in France is intimately linked, you know that, with the French Revolution. And this idea is that all of the humans share the faculty of reason, and that as a French citizen, we all have the same political rights, regardless of religion, sex, race, ethnicity, etc. This strong idea is bound up with the idea of laicity, the strict separation between the state and the church, and another powerful idea, the idea of the indivisibility of the Republic. Our differences, religious particularities, don't have the power to divide us. We are citizens before being individuals, before being Muslims, Black, women, etc., etc. So the enemies of the French republics are the ones who claim their differences and break this Republican pact by putting their individuality over their citizenship. What we call in French communautarisme. I could translate with ethnicity or particularism. That is to say, the idea that minorities come together as closed communities structured around specific social, cultural characteristics, such as race, religion, ethnicity, etc. Therefore, the claim of difference is a conscious destruction of a political space defined as one and indivisible. That is the story. What is happening now? The terms are changing and they are all turned upside down. And what we can say is that the language completely falls apart. Anti-racism has become racism. Chauvinism, strong nationalism has become universalism. First, the idea of universalism is used now to support assimilationist, conservative political claims. Being universal just means being French, a real French. And you all know what a real French means. Second, as the Republic is indivisible, it is almost impossible to express the idea that there are discriminations, especially racial discriminations in France. Indeed, the reaffirmation of socio-cultural characteristics to denounce unequal treatments is seen as the promotion of a particularism that divides the Republic. It becomes impossible for the people who are discriminated to explain the reasons why they are discriminated. And third, we don't use the word communautarisme, particularism anymore, but the word separatism. After the huge anti-racist demonstrations that took place in France, especially in Paris last June, and organized by the Adama Committee, close to the Black Lives Matter movement, this statement was made by our politics and even our president. The idea of community is a very strong idea. It is a concrete idea. And there are communities everywhere. If we want to be more precise, we must not condemn the word communitarism, communautarisme, but because the real enemy of the Republic is separatism. Are separatists those movements or people that breaks the Republic in two? I'm quoting our president. So the idea of separatism appeared after the death of George Floyd, after the huge anti-racist demonstrations that took the streets of Paris, after the lockdown to the pandemic. So one question, what is the link with critical thought, and especially post-colonial studies and decolonial turn, and this idea of separatism coming after those huge demonstrations. Those studies, and it was already said by the panelists, those studies are seen as the ideological foundations of this anti-racism that destroys the Republic, because anti-racism destroys the Republic. It's a kind of sophism that I don't understand, but perhaps we will have to hear. Ideological foundations of anti-racism, ideological foundations of separatism. I want to quote the French president during a very important discourse. When the law against separatism was voted, it was, I think, on October 2, 3 months ago. And the president said, targeted, of course, Islam. And there is a little sentence that is really interesting. He also said that we have to be concerned with those children of the Republic coming from immigrant descents or that are from Maghreb, sub-Saharan Africa, because those children of the Republic coming from Maghreb and sub-Saharan African are seduced by those studies of post-colonial, decolonial trends that are ideological foundations of separatism. This discourse is very scandalous, and this is a cynical way to target the enemies of France. Those young, I will be quite direct, those young Black and Arab scholars who benefited from the generosity of the Republican meritocracy are now the people who are destroying France. The struggle against separatism becomes a struggle that was fed from within by a generous republic that must now fight against those inassimilable citizens embodied by scholars of colors. So I think that one of the questions we have to have here during this discussion is perhaps a very difficult question that is difficult to have in France, in the academia, as you said, Nadia, is still about, we cannot pronounce the noun racism anymore. And it is very hard to describe and to understand or to underline the different strategies of structural racism that are still impacting the French academia.
Thank you, Yala. I mean, first I would want to see if any of you have a question for the other. For instance, if after listening to each other, if, you know, Muriel would want to ask Nadia or Didier would want to ask Yala or whatever first, I mean, you know, because it's a conversation. There are also, you know, 2 or 3 things that I noted and I would want to ask, unless also David has some question before that, if you want. I mean, I wanted also, I mean, perhaps I have a question for each of you, you know, because Didier, you were saying that this reactionary movement over there must also, I mean, at the end, to deny the disparities of, you know, that are going on. And it's true, but how do you, what I want to know that how do you see the, at the same time of Macron, the famous en même temps, you know, that we do this and we do that. How do you see in your analysis Macron doctrine of, you know, neither left nor right? You know, because he is always coming back to that. He's always saying, you know, trying to do that. Miriam, the fact that the question of the leftism cannot be involved in religion. I mean, that religion is, I find this very, very important, because I have noticed that the left does not understand anything about religion. I mean, the French left, I mean, you say religion, for them, it's alienation and so on. And the nostalgia, of course, the nostalgia for what was, but mostly this question of the religion, I would want you, if you can say more about that, because I do think it's important. Because I wonder that if in France, Islam is a religion, but not quite really a religion, not really what is called a religion. So, you know, if you could say something about that. Nadia, I mean, you know, what is academic freedom? And it's true, because I was also thinking of some of the reaction, you know, when some of the academics say Islamogauchism is not really a scientific notion, as if this was the point, you know, as if, you know, and so since it was not a scientific notion, we could be, you know, protected and saved, you know. And even though if we were Islamo-leftists, what would be the point, you know, what would be the danger, what would be the threat, you know? So what would be, what do you think about that? I mean, you know, this position from some academic in France saying that Islamo-leftism is not a real notion, is not a scientific notion, therefore, there is, you know, that it does not concern academia. It doesn't concern us, you know, because I do think it's connected with what you say, if I understood well. And Yala, I thought, yes, effectively, this thing that, you know, we gave education, we civilized these people, you know, these young people, they could come to the university, they even speak French, you know, good French, and then they turn against us. You know, they are turning against us. And if you could say a little more about that, because I do think that effectively there is also, and perhaps it's connected with what Didier, Nadia, and Miriam were saying also, that I mean, their world is shaking also. It's there. And so, but if we just see that as a reactionary, do we see just that as a reaction, also just as a melancholia from, you know, and nostalgia, or something else also? You know, the unresolved colonial question in France and the connection between a Republican value, what they call Republican universalism, and in fact the civilizing mission, the colonial civilizing mission. I mean, David, do you have any?
Thank you, Francoise, and thank you all for really trenchant and critical remarks. I just to pose a sort of general kind of canvas of question, picking up from Nadia Marzuki's remark about being really fatigued. It's funny, just a day ago, Francoise and I, as we were preparing for this, we're talking about the condition of exhaustion, right? And I was linking exhaustion, that notion of fatigue, also to the exhaustion of the planet, right? I mean, the exhausting of the planet through exhaustion, through a different related but different kind of exhaustion. But I wonder about connecting this to the way in which, as Yella was pointing out, anti-racism is being pointed to as destroying the Republic. I mean, the Republic has to be pretty weak if anti-racism is you know, what is being brought to destroy it. I mean, one just has to sort of remark that, but to link it to the way in which the language of critique is both being taken away and inhabited by the critics, by the right, right? That is you know, what conventionally was the language of anti-racism. And it happened, it's not just in France, it's pretty much everywhere. I mean, you see it in Germany, post-coloniality, but you've seen it for the last 40 years now, 35 years in the US. I mean, it was a quite strategic undertaking on the part of the right, and from Reagan onwards, to inhabit the terms of progressive anti-racist critique and to turn it around against itself. you know, it takes away the language of critique from the critics of racism and makes it impossible then to designate what the thing is that one's critiquing, right? So it vacates the possibility of critique. And I wonder whether something like that is not going on in this instance as well. I mean, there's a, you know, in a way, Fanon spoke of, you know, standing inside. I mean, when he says, I had incisors to test, right? In Black Skin, White Masks, he's saying, you know, you're calling me an animal? Let me show you what an animal looks like, right? And in a way, that strategy is being turned around against itself on the part of the right, inhabiting the very terms of critique in order to evacuate them of any kind of critical effect, and to take away the possibility of naming the very condition itself that is and should be the object of critique. And I sort of see similar strategies at work on the right over here. So I wonder whether there's something like that going on.
Okay, who want to start? I mean, do we start from do we start from Yala, then Nadia, then Myriam, then Didier? So we do the other way. Yala, no, tu ne veux pas. You don't want. Okay, Nadia?
Sure. So I wanna address your question, Françoise, and also maybe say a few words about this Macron doctrine of en même temps Didier, if you don't mind, because I think it's linked, this question of scientificity. So I think that it's a first of all, in terms of the debating the reaction of academics and academic institutions, there's an issue of temporality. I think it made sense strategically in a first step to just have a strategy of calling out the minister and say she's just saying nonsense and that doesn't make any sense. And I think it's very brave and important for all these academic institutions to really send this message and stand out and call out. But then in a second step, I think you're absolutely right that there is something very problematic in just being content with this distinction, like between what's real, what's really a social fact, and what's just a fallacy, because we all know that this whole category of Islamoleftism has produced political effects that are very real, and that was the meaning of my first intervention. I think what I find missing in conversations among academics right now is really an embrace of the political aspect of this discussion and of the political meaning of Islam and Islamoleftism, and the degree to which Islam has been for decades and remains the blind spot of the thinking of politics, but also of social sciences, because Islam is this just sort of embodies the ultimate other in a way maybe that race is in the US towards the history of the founding of the nation and the discussion of the founding of the US Constitution. I would say Islam plays that role of the ultimate irreconcilable other of the French Republic. And I don't see much debate among these coalitions that are very well-meaning in terms of defending academic freedom. But I think this question, this argument of what pertains to science and what pertains to unscience is actually very important and a very important expression of the Macron moment, right? And we talked a lot in the past days about how this whole witch hunt is an expression of McCarthyism and of the polarization and the culture wars. But and we've made comparisons with the Trumpist moment in the US, but I think there is something maybe specific to develop and investigate in the French situation right now. And I really love the phrase of French historian Pierre Cernat, criticize Macronism as the ideology of extreme center, right? And I think this expression is brilliant because it does capture the contradiction and the ambiguity and the toxicity of this ideology center, because it's the ideology of at the same time, en même temps, neither left nor right, etc. This is well known, but it is very extreme and extremely toxic in the sense that it does support agendas and views that are in line with illiberal populist views, you know, a la Hungary or countries that have launched similar wars on academia. But it is disguised in the language of respectability and decency and civility and science. And the people who attack us, the members of the observatory that Didier mentions, they rejoice in saying how they embody science and how we embody unscience. And they say, so in a way that's different from Trump, because Trump was perfectly happy with saying, you know, he's happy with fake news, he doesn't believe in science and whatnot. Whereas the difference is that it's this toxic pretension to embody science, decency, civility, and portray the others as these radical, dangerous infiltrators. So, I think this whole discussion about what's science and what's not is extremely dangerous, and it's a perfect illustration of the toxic aspect of this ideology of the extreme center, to again quote from Pierre Cernat.
Thank you, Nadia. Myriam, you want to go next?
Yeah,
Myriam?
thank you. Nadia, I appreciated your comments about the extreme center, and it makes me think that we're living also through a moment of kind of Enlightenment fundamentalism, right? That Macron himself, it's about, the extreme center is also about embodying rationality and being able to discount those as infantile, as irrational, and positioning yourself somehow above it in this technocratic vein of what I do is managing, and I'm beyond politics of left and right. And it made me think of something that I think ties into Françoise's question, which is going back to Ernest Renan and the debate about Islam and science, right? And the notion, the exceptionality of Islam, one of the debates was always that it was incapable of producing the same kind of rational thought. And so it's really interesting to me that Islam functions as this allegedly obvious signifier, that we know what Islam means, when, you know, that is, as you have mentioned, the site of a lot of debates, both theological, sociological, etc. And so, Françoise, to get back to your question, you know, there is a sense, I think, Nadia, you pointed out this, that Islam has always been exceptional, going back to Napoleon, who, you know, when he comes to Egypt, doesn't think he can do the same thing in Italy because, you know, you have to rule Muslims through Islam, so you can't introduce the same kind of secularism. The law of 1905, which of course is never applied in Algeria. I don't want to overdo the historian thing here, but certainly there is an exceptionality. And what I find really interesting about the race question is that looking at texts, not only Renan, but Gobineau, even Weber, there is a sense at which Islam is also about bloodlines. It's about bloodlines, it's about environment. And so again, this notion that Islam is about the Quran or the Hadith, and those of us who work on the Islamic world know that that doesn't mean anything, but bref, you know, we'll let that go, that somehow this is, you know, not about a discourse on race and origin and environment in a 19th century capacity is just wrong. It's, you know, if you read the text. And so I think that, you know, some of this argumentation, and I know this is not surprising, and perhaps it's, you know, I think it's quite naive in some ways to say, you know, you haven't done your homework when you have the, you know, the Minister of the Interior who, when is asked about police violence, says, oh no, this is Weber 101. This is as old as Weber, right? I mean, talk about a disrespect for what we do. So I'll leave it there, but thank you for those questions.
Didier?
Yes, thank you very much. So I want to start with what Nadia and Yala have said about fatigue. And I should say that I often think of my friends or my children's friends who are Muslims, and every time coming back to whatever this the event is, every time going back to this this hostility against Muslims and very often Islam. You may remember that when to sort of close the Yellow Vest movement, Emmanuel Macron proposed to do a grand débat, the great debate. There were 84 questions, and he insisted in having 4 questions, I think, 2 on secularism, and asking whether we should go further in secularism. So the question was oriented already. And 2 on immigration, asking whether we should have more control on immigration, whether we should have quota of immigration. And these were not part of the agenda or the list of recommendations or requirement from the Yellow Vest movement. So and I think that, you know, coming all the time, you know, this fatigue that you're describing is, I think, a fatigue also from many, I suppose, many Muslims with this coming back over and over. And since you're asking about Françoise, you're asking about Macron and being neither left nor right. I think many of us have never believed, even when he was only a candidate, that he would be neither left nor right. He's a banker. He comes from that world, and I always thought of François Mitterrand's sentence about the center and people who said they were neither right nor left. He said, when I hear someone saying I'm neither right nor left, I think that it is a center that is neither left nor left. And I think that's the idea of being neither left nor left. That is really what characterizes Macron. And this is why, to go to David's question about the weakness of the Republic, which I think is a very good diagnosis. There's and particularly in the case of Emmanuel Macron, that of course that's a structural problem, but there's a circumstantial issue with Emmanuel Macron, who was ready to deal with economic and financial issues, but was not ready to deal with protests and social movements. And by lack of authority, it turned to authoritarianism, and which is very typical. I mean, we have never had such a violent, well, I mean, in the recent decades, I should say, you know, in the 60s, we had worse. But in the recent decades, we've never had such a violent police. So the lack of authority goes with a need for authoritarianism, and I think that's a very good diagnosis. Speaking of left and right, I briefly touched it, but what makes the situation and the ideology of France very particular, these attacks on that we've described, the 4 of us, or even the 6 of us, is that you have an unusual alliance between a certain left and most of the right. A certain left which is only able to think in terms of class, and most of the right, which is focused on this false universalism that we've been describing before. And in that regard, when we think of this false universalism, we have to remember, and at least for the for maybe a US public audience, that it is only in the late 1990s that we started in France to speak about racial discrimination. And even it was discrimination, and the adjectival qualifier racial was very difficult to introduce in the debate. And this was a very short window of time when it was possible to talk about racial discrimination. And then we saw this terrible backlash that you have all described. And finally, I would like to put in relation what we've been talking about until now with the question of state xenophobia and the dealing with immigration, because we have at the moment a terribly harsh practice, police practice, and policing, I would say, of immigration. I do my research at the moment at the French-Italian border, and it is there is a reinforcement, a strengthening of the policing of the borders, but also a brutalization of immigrants in Calais, for example, but also in Paris, breaking the tents where they are trying to find a refuge, throwing all their belongings and beating them up, which is something that has to do with what Yala was saying about the children of these immigrants. This is where we should think about what will be the children of these people treated like in this way.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to say yes. What after just Nadia and Miriam say, that for me, all the friends and also what Didier say about the children of his friends, that so many friends of mine are talking about the daily ritual of humiliation that they have to encounter. Really, a ritual of humiliation that make them, it's humiliation. It's constant little things, like nothing, but it's ritual, like from morning to evening. It's everywhere, in the bus, in the shop, everywhere. And that is part of this Islamophobia. That is not just, the insult or the attack like that, but this constant reminder of that you are not part of this place and you are really excluded. And this, and especially the veil, really, that and effectively we could have a discussion like that on that. And as Nadia said, there will be a lot to say about feminism then, if we were talking about that. So Yala, and after we have a lot of questions from the public. So Yala, and then after that, I will read the question of
I wanted to thank you, Françoise, for your question. I think it's a simple and very difficult question, what you asked, because of course we have this kind of a post-colonial melancholia in France, but also we have to face what you call those unresolved colonial questions in France. I just wanted to give a kind of scandalous example of the type of insults you can find in France. We have a brilliant journalist, a Black woman called Rokhaya Diallo. And I remember once, I think it was 2 months ago, a man said on TV, a journalist said that if she had not been educated in France, she would have been a big African woman married to a polygamous husband with 16 children. So we are here, we have here exactly what you said about the link between what Republic is and the idea of civilization. We have to domesticate those children, those bad children, and those good and they become good citizens when they are able to say thank you. The bad citizens are those who are always just trying in those post-colonial trends to question the past of France. But just to say something else, I think what is difficult in this moment is that the analyses, the political analyses are multiple. We have, of course, this political moment of the presidential campaign. We have, of course, the fact that the far right has been working for years to impose this agenda and this kind of ideologies. But there is also a foreign politic in France. And what is interesting is to see also that at the moment, our country is in war in Sahel, for example, that you have new kind of political practices to restore the image of France in Africa at the same time. You have, what can I say, you have a lot of advertising, or you have a lot of promotion of French citizens that are described as the people of the diaspora. So we have to link, I think, all of those, this situation with this double language. I mean, perhaps the language of the at the same time. That is to say that we have at the same time some scholars of colors, because this is what it is about, trying to question this colonial past of France, and at the same time you have reconfigurations of the African French politic. So I think I would love to question that, because I think it's very difficult. You have we have a lot of expression of what is called France-Afrique that are reconfiguring themselves now in Africa. And of course, all those scholars based in France who are questioning the colonial past of France are also, in fact, questioning the actual relationship between France and its ex-colonies. And I think it is also at the core of all the debates and all the discussions we have now. Perhaps, yeah.
Well, thank you, Yala. Just, some of you know me, so I will remind everyone that France is still a colonial empire, right? That there is New Caledonia, Kanaki, the island in the Pacific, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyana, Réunion, and Mayotte. And in some of them, like in Mayotte, you do also have incredible Islamophobia, because we know the Comoro archipelago are absolutely majority Muslim. So there is that also that quite often disappear when we speak about France, but it's there, and France is still having, colonial territory, which had, to your point, Nadia. So, I mean, so many questions, we got like so many, so I have to start. I'm going to read like 3 of them, and then you will see who want to answer, okay? So, David Palomboliu, what are the best way people outside France can help? Nadia, how can they help, outside of the French? What are the connection? Okay, the identity politics are imported wholesale from the US. What can we say about that? Do the panelists think that Macron fight against Islamoleftism is a winning strategy toward the presidential election? Does not it risk to exacerbate racism and Islamophobia in a way that will make citizens vote Le Pen, since she is known to have defended a tough stance of Islam for a long time? Okay, so identity politics, best way to help, and is it a good strategy for the presidential? Okay, so I will read 2 more because there are so many and I don't want. Hello, Donna Jones, Didier and Yala, do you think that crisis, political and historical, prompt universalist Okay. Yes, that the crisis, political and historical, prompts universalists to retreat to a cynical reactionary form. French universalism, as Senghor mentioned, is really French first. Is such a reactionary universalism an indication of what is imaginable for an unfranchised multiracial state? Excellent point. Okay, there is from our friend Achille Membe. Thank you. But one sees similar trend in other European countries. Such is the case in Germany, where the reaction is clothed in the language of anti-Semitism. While accounting for the specific historical trajectories they take, how do we begin to read these forms of late Eurocentrism beyond the national frame as a global movement in their own right? So that's it for now. Who want to go first? I mean, you don't have to answer, of course, all the questions. You just have raise your hand, as we say. No, nobody. Okay, Nadia.
Yeah, so there was a question about what could be done by scholars abroad, and I see at the bottom another question about better forms of allyship, so maybe I can address all these together. I think they point to the same questions. I think to go back to my point about fatigue and exhaustion, and I think one thing, and also that links back to Sindre's comment. I don't know if Sindre's you're still around, but it's just to maybe support academics based in France and just continuing working by, also just providing us with like opportunities like these to just talk and think and just think together and make progress in our discussions. I find this conversation today is extremely helpful for me, and I think you can't just dismiss the level of exhaustion every day. It just takes away time from our own writing, our own work. It's just like this feeling that every day, whenever you hear the TV, the radio, you read the news, it's just everywhere. So there's this feeling of being completely overwhelmed, and it just sort of gets to you. So I think any sort of forum that allows for the continuation of collective work, because this is what's at stake, this is what's attacked. It's this notion that ideas should not circulate. We should just sit very nicely in our little office and read, I don't know, Renan maybe, and that's it. And I mean, of course, this is not going to happen, but right now, what needs to be done is, on the contrary, a focus on continuing transnational work and international work with the US, with the Global South, and just continue imagining together ways of encouraging these transnational conversations. And that links to my second point. I think there was a question about identity politics and this issue of contagion and infiltration from the US or something. And I mean, I thought that what Nadia Yala was saying about how separatism, the language of separatism, occurred and became prominent really after the Comité Adama protest is so important and so true. And I think that actually maybe suggests that there is something about not just a fear of US ideas produced in American campuses. I think maybe the trigger the turning point was this connection of solidarity, of grassroots solidarity between US protesters against police violence and anti-Black racism, and same in France with different language. But when you go back to all the comments, it was then that it was really a moral panic about some part of the French sort of conservative establishment. Look at all these ideas about race that they're infiltrating. And I think there's something around this notion and this vocabulary of contagion that was triggered by the presence of Black bodies in the French public square, which is the first in sort of the French, I mean, to that extent. And I think it's just, this is the conversation. It's not about identity politics. And I think we're sort of missing the target when we're talking about whether or not ideas circulate from universities in the US. I think what's really at stake is these grassroots solidarity, forms of solidarities. And just I'll finish there. I think maybe a productive way to keep thinking critically about these issues is to just drop altogether this notion of republicanism, because to be honest, it's not even, according to the sort of right-wing standards, it's not even about republicanism anymore. I think maybe a more productive concept would be that of Puritanism. What's at stake right now is not Puritanism in the sense of American Protestant, etc., but it's this sort of ethics of purity. And also in the context of the pandemic, and as you said, David, the exhaustion, etc. But it's like remove any source of contagion from, you know, immigrant bodies, Black bodies, just remove them. Just make sure that France is just being protected from all sorts of impurity. And the ritualism that you were describing, Françoise, that the sort of sense of like the pressure for citizens to conform, not to ideals, not to values, but to bodily practices that are deemed the only ones acceptable to fit in. This is ritualism, this is tribalism, it's not even republic anymore. So I think it's just, we need to step up, you know, the conversation and the sort of critical discourse, and just not buy into this discussion about republic and all. I think it's something much more dangerous right now.
Well, thank you. If I may add something, and I have the right to do that, since and because also there was a question about how the STOA report fits into that. It's also because, Yana, you were talking about the foreign policy. What's happening in Algeria, I think, also is quite, you know, reflecting the movement, the social movement. What's happening? It's troubling also, the constant, there must a certain pleasure in France that, you know, if it's failing, you know, the fact that independence cannot win, you know, there is an anti-colonialism in France, a fact that to say decolonization failed, and especially in Algeria. That's also for me some kind of a little secret. Any other answer to the question, you know?
Yeah, I can say something.
Okay, sorry, I'm talking.
Yeah. So to start with the last one, Achille's question. Of course, we were asked to talk about attacks against critical theories in France. So we spoke about France, but it's entirely right to think or to suggest that we should think on a more international, if not global, level. And these issues that we've been talking about can be seen from Brazil to India, from Poland to Hungary. But even in, as you mentioned, in countries where you would less expect it, although the situation, that's Germany, although the situation in Germany is very complicated around the question of anti-Semitism, as he knows well, and I think that although we only David, I think, mentioned it, or maybe others, I may be wrong, mentioned it. In the background, there's this Palestine-Israel question that remains. You cannot read some of the reactions and some of the reaction we've been talking about, if you don't have in mind the positioning of many intellectuals in relation to a defense of the politics of Israel and the shift from critiques of that politics to anti-Zionism, to anti-Semitism, and so this is very obvious. I could give very precise examples. I will not, but I could. So it is something that is in the background, very little mentioned because of its very sensitive character, but it is very important. And so, in a way, I would say the question about what should we do, how could we help when we're abroad, I would say do it in your country. If we're talking about the United States, that's something I wanted to say, but for lack of time, I didn't want to develop it. But at the moment, you have in New Hampshire, West Virginia, and Oklahoma, legislators discussing bills against, quote, the propagation of divisive concepts. You have bills in Missouri, Mississippi, Arkansas, and South Dakota introducing the banning from teaching in public schools of the very important New York Times 1619 project on the history of race and slavery. So, and I've mentioned other countries before. So I would say, it is very generous to look at other countries, but the struggle starts in your own. And is it a winning strategy for Emmanuel Macron to try to go to the right? I think that's what he thinks. He thinks that at the last moment, when there will be a duel between the two, between Marine Le Pen and himself, people will not dare to vote for not vote for him. What appears now is that there's an increasing number of people, especially, of course, from the left, who have been so disappointed that they say, we will not vote for him. And so it might be just a threat, but at the moment, I've been saying for years to my colleagues in the United States that there was absolutely no chance that Marine Le Pen would win the election, in a presidential election in France. And I was convinced of that. Right now, I would not say that. I would not say the contrary either, but I would not say that. And for me, that's a huge change in the way I see my country.
It's what we said about Trump in 2016.
Yeah.
Watch out.
Well, to also add to what just you said, Didier. Long time ago, when Italian communists went to Vietnam and met with Ho Chi Minh, and they said to Ho Chi Minh, what can we do? What can we do to help Vietnam? What can we do? And so they repeat the question, and finally Ho Chi Minh said, do the revolution in your own country. That's how you will help Vietnam. So you see, you're right. Okay, Myriam?
Thanks. I have a lot of comments just to say in what good company I find myself tonight. So thank you again. I wanted to get back to what Nadia was saying about the threat of the grassroots level. And I do think, if you look at the laws that are being put in place, part of it is about any social movement being able to dissolve grassroots organizations. I mean, this is the real threat. And I think part of the state's imaginary is about institutions like the CFCM being able to have state bodies that do the work of controlling these discussions. And I think that also ties in, Françoise, to what you were saying about the Hirak and what you were saying about colonial memory. Thinking about the Rapport Stora, there's this notion that it's the state's role to write this history, that it should be the French state and the Algerian state that somehow come to terms, right? And the kinds of words being used go back to what Nadia was saying, right? Repentance is a Christian notion. And so this need to calm colonial memories at the state level completely, I mean, it does two things. On the one hand, it completely ignores the ongoing demands by the Hirak and Algerians living in France that Macron stops doing things like celebrating and congratulating Tebboune, who has been elected illegitimately in the eyes of many Algerians, to stop deploying police forces, gendarmerie into the Sahel and continuing this military neo-colonial France-Afrique. So I think we're also at a moment where this juxtaposition of grassroots versus state control is dominating the ability to both come to terms with colonial past, as if the state needs to somehow do that, but also as a smokescreen for ongoing neo-colonial policies. And I would recommend everybody look at Noureddine Amara and Afaf Zekour, who wrote a great article in Mediapart. And I would, for people who are interested in the Rapport Stora, I would send them there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something and to go back to what was said. First, perhaps the question of solidarity among academics. I think it is a very difficult question, a very tough question, not only because all those reactionary movements came from the academia, because I think that the scholars that are targeted are also targeted by their colleagues. But the thing is that it is very hard now to organize a kind of political battle, not only, not because we are weak or that because we have integrated the idea that we were not powerful anymore, but because the work we have to do is the work of a political party. I mean, we don't have the time to create new languages to oppose to those alt-right concepts that are thrown in the public space. This is not our work. This will be the work of people that are working in communication for a political party. This should be the work of politicians. And now at the moment, we don't have those spaces and those kind of political strong solidarities that could in a way protect us. One other thing, we could say we could use the justice, and we have to use the justice and the justice institution to condemn all those people who are endangering now the scholars by saying that they are complicit to Islamism, or that they are producing knowledges that are in ideological foundations to terrorism. But just one example. Yesterday, we had the news that Nicolas Sarkozy was condemned by the justice because for many stories of corruption. What is the reaction today in the media or in the political sphere? The reaction is that he is innocent and this is a political plot. So even the justice and those institutions that are supposed to protect us and to be strong are now taken in these strange moments where they are weakened, and when all the vocabulary and the languages we use make them fragile. So it is very hard to fight now, because as scholars, our work is exactly what you said, Nadia, is to put the right noun on the things. Of course, what we are living now has nothing to do with republicanism. And I think that some people can still defend this idea of republic, even the idea of universalism, which is really strong and powerful in the political struggle. But the fact is that what we are facing now and our work is to put the right nouns on things. And what we are facing now has nothing to do with republicanism, has nothing to do with the new expression of universalism. It has to do with what Stuart Hall called racial fundamentalism. This is fundamentalism, and we have to fight against that. And there is only a last thing that I wanted to say. It was more with what Donna Jones asked about the multiracial republic. I don't remember exactly the question, but of course we can quote. There is a Black French intellectual history in my country, I mean, and there is a Black French reinterpretation of universalism. And I think the work of Césaire and Senghor try just to show how this French republicanism was linked to colonial history, and that what we had to do now is to recreate new terms to rethink a new kind of universalism. And of course, a universalism, a real universalism, is built on differences and not on their cancelling.
Thank you. Okay, other question, another round of question about the working class. Is the working class in France totally whitened? And also opposing racialized workers and therefore supporting extraction abroad for their own, privilege. About Macron, is it opportunism or, what's happening, or just, white supremacy? A question about Charlie, I am Charlie, and, all what created around, you have to say I am Charlie. And in a way also what Didier remark about the murder of Samuel Paty that we had also. I mean, all this demand that we have to say something, that we have to say a certain thing, not just we against, of course, we condemn the murder, but we have to have the specific word to say that. To Yala, there was a question about could you say about the impact on young non-white scholar on scholarly production. And I think already that, yes, about Charlie. Was Charlie somehow just supposed to be understood as being a scientific concept or a universally transparent one to boot? Okay, so is there anyone who want to answer this different question? And just also to say about what I have also a question, perhaps also to Didier and to the four of you, because we talk about the left and we talk about the right and the center and the extreme center, but there is also a critique of the left that was made by Césaire already in Discourse on Colonialism, of course, and in his letter of resignation in 1956. And then later on by Fanon, but not just by Fanon, but also by people in Guadeloupe and Martinique and Réunion, but nobody knows their names. And this is something, the connection between the left in France and colonialism and racial thinking that has never been really, I don't think I've never really been discussed. It's remained totally on the side. What is your thought about that? The decolonization of the left, its ambiguous position constantly with Madagascar, Cameroon, Indochina. Not always the same, but nonetheless, and to this day, towards police violence, what is the crime, impunity of the police, the question of Islamophobia, and the fact also that in the huge demonstration 2019 or 2020 against Islamophobia said in 2019. The fact that some people from the left, among them Mélenchon, participated is today, also used against him. So how do you see that also? Because it's connected to some of the questions. It's not the exact question that are raised, but connected to this question. Myriam?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to say a few words on Algeria, and I think this goes back to the question of the fragility of the republic. But Maurice Thorez, in the 1940s saying, it's a nation in formation, it's not a nation yet, and that the class struggle has to come before any solidarity with anti-colonial nationalism. And I think we know that story. That's a story that is told. But for example, when French leftists, Trotskyists, anarchists go to Algeria in the 1960s, many of them team up with Ben Bella, they help him do land redistribution, et cetera. And if you read the archives of those, they basically say, he's not a real leftist. This is feudalism still, and eventually the Algerian people will have a real revolution where they discard themselves of these feudalist trappings of Islam. And so I think there's a longer colonial history of the left and the way it engages with decolonial struggles that was, to large part, of course, there were exceptions, but was nevertheless in large part on their terms, the way they saw the world. And I think this comes back to the question of identity politics, where in the US, we think of the work of Mark Lilla, and this is often brought up by the right, that identity politics is running away with society and we're not able to analyze class anymore. Often in France, it's a question on the left, as was already mentioned about the book, the Race et Sciences Sociales book, right? This was by people with good leftist credentials who nevertheless, blame certain sections of the academy for having racialized what is actually a social question.
Anyone else would want to say something? Nadia?
Yeah, I can maybe address the question about the working class and divisions. So there are polls every day that try to make us believe that 60% or 70% of the French society is actually convinced that there is an Islamo-gauchist threat. And so that's one thing, but there's also a number of sociological studies that have shown that society is actually maybe not as polarized as some politicians wanna us to believe, even in the aftermath of the Charlie and Bataclan attacks. And that they have been able to find mechanisms and ways to address conflicts on a grassroots, everyday level. Want to quote, for example, Jai's book, La guerre civile n'aura pas lieu, or Jérôme Truc, sociologist, very important work also on the reaction of French society to the attacks. And so these works are very important because they show that there is a level of resilience and rejection of polarization on an everyday basis. Now, in terms of the working class, I think the Gilets jaunes is an interesting case. Didier was mentioning early on the debates that Macron sort of proposed at the national level, and there's this interesting story of a case where Robert Ménard, the sort of far right mayor, tried to impose to one of these debates the topic of migration and identity. And the Gilets jaunes that gathered then that day were like, no, we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about our economics and social issues. So this image that, according to which there's on the one hand the Gilets jaunes that are like these sort of racist hillbillies, and then on the other hand the banlieue, and that they're divided. This actually doesn't correspond to what actually happened. I think there's more work to be done on the possibility of these coalitions. But what's interesting in the example of the Menard episode is that there was just a spontaneous rejection of these people, of this sort of racist agenda. So I think it's not obvious at all that there's this clear dichotomy between the working class and the migrants, or Islam and identity.
Yeah.
Didier?
Yes. Maybe to follow up on this, on Nadia's answer about the working class. So there's this belief again that politicians push, and you see that in not only in France but also in the United States for the Trumpist vote, that it comes from the working class, and so you would have the working class would be both racist and voters for the Rassemblement National, the far right. I don't want to say that there's not something of that, which is in particular because in the case of the vote for the Rassemblement National, because of the disappointment that they've had from those who have been in power from the left and from the right, and with very little structural changes and benefits for or improvement of the situation. So I would not want to consider that it's absolutely not true. But it is extremely exaggerated, and it hides the fact that behind that the vote for the Rassemblement National is also from middle class and from upper class as well. And asking about the question, is the working class now a white working class? If I understood well the question, I think there's a very important presence of people of color and especially sub-Saharan Africans in certain jobs, and in particular everything that has to do with construction, a lot of what has to do with restaurants, but in the backs, the part that you don't see, and also and that's very gendered, the whole economy of care, which is really possible for older people in particular, which is only possible because of these usually African women or women of African origin. So there's still a very important presence in the working class of people, the majority of them being documented, but a minority being undocumented. And as you can imagine, and it will be the same in the United States, the part that documented can be much more exploited. The salaries are lower, the protections are usually none. The question, so I'm not sure I understood the question about Charlie and the beheading of Samuel Paty. One thing that, if I understood part at least of the question, one thing that is remarkable and has to do with what I was referring earlier after Nadia and Yala about the fatigue, is that every time you have such an act, you have interviews of Muslims, and in particular Muslim leaders, who have to say that they disapprove, that they're not that it's not the way they see Islam. So there's, as if because you're a Muslim, you would have to say that when it's not asked, of course, to the rest of the population. And finally, I'm not sure I can answer correctly to your question, your very interesting question, Françoise, about the left and colonialism, because I'm not an historian, and I others would do it much better. I would say that there's still this. What remains, what is the most visible today is how the left was against the Algerian colonization, how they were for the decolonization, for example, how they were denouncing torture and all this. So you have these heroes that are visible, and they were they had a very strong commitment to the cause. But what was more the political dimension of it is, I think, still very unexplored, as you said. And finally, if the word Islamo-leftism was not so loaded, you could say, as Nadia was suggesting, that you start to see something of some political connections between people living in the banlieue and people from the left in terms of coalition or coalition of protest, I would say, which is relatively new, because at the very beginning of the Yellow Vest movement, the reaction of the young people in particular, but not only them in the banlieue, was to say, well, they were not going to the protest or demonstrations, and they were saying, these people, they discover what we've been experiencing on an everyday basis. With the police violence, etc., and race, and also racism in their case. But I've been observing in some of the studies that I am doing that you see this connection between the committees for justice, truth and justice, and left or leftist young people. So there's the emergence of something that is, of course, that has nothing to do with Islamo-leftism, but is a connection between people, many of them being Muslims, and people from the left trying to develop ideas. But I'm not talking about the university. I'm talking about different.
Well, thank you anyway, Nadia and Didier, to show that the question of the working class is much more complex. And effectively, they all got a lot of strike now by women cleaning, the hotel, always, Black women, or the Gilets Noirs also, because we talk about always the yellow vest, but the black vest, and who are absolutely present in every, very courageous, and also bringing the question of working. So that's very important, and connect to a whole history of organization by non-white working class. That is that, and there was, and also what you are saying, Didier, the rediscovery of that history, also of this memory, that the way it plays today, also in this coalition or platform of alliance. Okay, I think it's going to be it's time now. So Yala, you have since you did not, you have the last, 1 second, 2 seconds to say something.
2 seconds. Okay, I just wanted to
whatever because we are ready to wrap up.
Only said I just wanted to answer to the question about the racialized scholars. What are they doing in the academia? First, it's not because you are racialized that you make a revolution in the academia. You have to have a reflexive way about what are the problems of the academia, and perhaps how the relations of power are shaping the academia. But what is interesting is first, there are racialized scholars, I mean, there are scholars of colors in France. And for example, in my discipline in philosophy, what did we do exactly? We just brought the world into philosophy, and we dismantled the racialized history of philosophy that is taught usually in the university or even in the elementary school or in the lycée, sorry. And this is the basic work of decolonizing the university. And I think that this process of decolonization are really important. I think that many people, many students are seduced for good reasons to those processes, because we are all just saying very simple things. I mean, for example, just for Black people think. And I have to say that just this little statement was very hard to affirm sometimes in my institution, because I remember when I became an associate professor in my university, the first question people were asking is, are they writing text in Africa? If they don't write text, they are not able to think or to produce a philosophy. So you have all those cliches, all those ideas, all those what we could call geographies of spirits that are still shaping sometimes the academia. And I think that many people and many scholars of color are just breaking this, not to destroy, of course, the academia, but just to decolonize, I think, the corpuses and the libraries that we are teaching to our students. And I just wanted to say just a little last thing, but it's more French. I remember a discussion I had with the great historian in Paris. His name is Patrick Boucheron. And the thing is, we have a pun in French that says faire des histoires, make a fuss of something. And what is interesting is that, for example, the history of colonization is never seen as a part of the French history with the big H, but only as those little stories of those people who font des histoires, who make a fuss about nothing. And this is what it's about, how this country will be able to understand that its history is shaped by their stories, that is to say, our stories. So this is the point I just wanted to finish with.
Well, thank you, Jana. Thank you, all of you. I mean, I know that there is a lot of questions we did not answer, and there will be much more to say. And I'm going to leave the last word to David, but thank you again to Myriam, Nadia, Yala, and Didier for the conversation. And thank you, of course, to David, to the team of OSHRE, and to everyone who came and to listen to us. David?
So thank you. Just three almost sloganeering comments. The first is that exhaustion is used as a strategy to disarm the left. So speaking as a Californian, we need to get some sun in order to re-energize ourselves again and again. The aim is to exhaust, and one has to, of course, resist that. The second is identity is also a right relational condition that divide and rule was perfected under colonialism as a political strategy of control. And if you think there's no claim to identity on the right, I mean, Génération Identitaire just expresses it explicitly. So I don't think one has to say more than that. And then thirdly, Nadia's very important point about the relation of separation and purity, which you call Puritanism, is a general racist strategy, and it was pointed out by Lacan in a rather obscure paper that what he called segregation and purity always underpin racisms. So that there's a way in which segregation is a reach in order to enable the possibility of retaining what is conceived as a claim to purity and puritanicalism, if one can put it in those terms. So, how we create a kind of set of or extend global relations as an organizing strategy without, of course, intruding upon sort of local leadership in development, I think is very important. This has been really quite an extraordinary discussion. I want to thank you all, Françoise Vergès, for your incredible engagement as always. We always seem to do really interesting things together, so we should continue to do this, you know, in perpetuity. And to Miriam Halle-Davis, Nadia Marzouki, Didier Fasson, and Diala Kisukiri, just thank you so much for a really extraordinary engagement. We have recorded this, so with everybody's permission, we will post it. We'll give, obviously, the panelists a chance to weigh in, but we'll post this for others to engage with these ideas. Thanks so much, to be continued. To the staff of UCHRI, as Françoise said, always a big shout out, and to all of you, stay safe, and as a recently passed politician in the US says, make good trouble. Thanks very much.